At 3:12 in the morning, the system was still working. Sirens were active. Radar was tracking. Interceptors were ready. Everything was behaving exactly as it had been designed to behave for decades. And then, within seconds, it stopped making sense. The alerts did not come in waves. They came all at once. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. A density of targets so extreme that the radar display itself became unreadable. Operators thought it was a glitch, a software failure. Something inside the system had to be broken, because the alternative was impossible. But the raw signal told a different story. 5,000 individual objects, moving faster than anything the system had ever tracked at scale, converging on the same geographic area, not randomly, not chaotically, precisely timed, precisely spaced, designed to arrive within a window so narrow that no response cycle could keep up. This was not an attack in the conventional sense. It was a calculation that had already been solved before the first missile left the ground. Because once the timeline began, there was no sequence of actions that could stop what was coming. And this is where the assumption breaks. For decades, the belief was simple. Any missile can be intercepted. Any threat can be reduced. Any system can be scaled to respond. But that belief depends on one condition, that the number of incoming targets remains within the limits of physical response. That night, that condition disappeared. What you are about to see is not the story of a system failing under pressure. It is the story of a system encountering a problem it was never designed to solve. A problem defined not by power, but by mathematics. A problem where the outcome was determined before the first detection alert ever triggered. Because once 5,000 missiles were in the air, the question was no longer whether they could be stopped. The question was why anyone believed they could be stopped in the first place. And that is where this story really begins. Most systems do not fail suddenly. They fail gradually. One missed intercept, then another. A delay in response. A saturation point that builds over time. That is how every previous missile attack has worked. That is what every defense doctrine is built around. And that is exactly why the first assumption was wrong. When the initial detections came in, the system treated them as a familiar pattern. A large-scale launch, yes, but still within a known framework. The expectation was simple. Intercept as many as possible. Absorb the rest. Maintain operational continuity. That logic had worked before. It had worked every time. But this time, the pattern never stabilized. There was no spacing between targets, no manageable sequence, no opportunity to prioritize. The system was not dealing with a wave. It was dealing with a compression of time itself. Thousands of trajectories collapsing into a single engagement window. And this is where the miscalculation becomes critical. Every defense system is built on a hidden assumption that time can be stretched, that engagements can be sequenced, that even under pressure, there is always a next step. But here, there was no next step, only simultaneous demands, simultaneous threats, simultaneous decisions that all had to be made at once. Operators began assigning targets, then reassigning, then abandoning assignments entirely as new data overrode old priorities faster than decisions could be executed. Interceptors launched, but before impact confirmations could return, new targets had already entered the same engagement envelope. The system was not just overwhelmed. It was desynchronized. And once synchronization is lost, control disappears. Because defense is not just about firepower. It is about timing, precision, order. Remove that order, and even the most advanced system becomes reactive instead of predictive. And a reactive system is always one step behind. But this is where it gets more serious. Because even if the system had remained perfectly synchronized, even if every radar track was clean and every interceptor launched on time, it still would not have been enough. Not because of a failure in execution, but because the problem itself could not be solved. So the real question is no longer how the system responded. The real question is what kind of problem forces even a perfect system to fail. And the answer begins with a number. Most systems do not fail suddenly. They fail gradually. One missed intercept, then another, a delay in response, a saturation point that builds over time. That is how every previous missile attack has worked. That is what every defense doctrine is built around. And that is exactly why the first assumption was wrong. When the initial detections came in, the system treated them as a familiar pattern. A large-scale launch, yes, but still within a known framework. The expectation was simple. Intercept as many as possible, absorb the rest, maintain operational continuity. That logic had worked before. It had worked every time. But this time, the pattern never stabilized. There was no spacing between targets, no manageable sequence, no opportunity to prioritize. The system was not dealing with a wave. It was dealing with a compression of time itself. Thousands of trajectories collapsing into a single engagement window. And this is where the miscalculation becomes critical. Every defense system is built on a hidden assumption. That time can be stretched, that engagements can be sequenced, that even under pressure there is always a next step. But here, there was no next step. Only simultaneous demands, simultaneous threats, simultaneous decisions that all had to be made at once. Operators began assigning targets, then reassigning, then abandoning assignments entirely as new data overrode old priorities faster than decisions could be executed. Interceptors launched, but before impact confirmations could return, new targets had already entered the same engagement envelope. The system was not just overwhelmed, it was desynchronized. And once synchronization is lost, control disappears. Because defense is not just about firepower, it is about timing, precision, order. Remove that order and even the most advanced system becomes reactive instead of predictive. And a reactive system is always one step behind. But this is where it gets more serious. Because even if the system had remained perfectly synchronized, even if every radar track was clean, and every interceptor launched on time, it still would not have been enough. Not because of a failure in execution, but because the problem itself could not be solved. So the real question is no longer how the system responded. The real question is what kind of problem forces even a perfect system to fail? And the answer begins with a number. The number sounds abstract at first, 5,000. It does not feel real, not until you place it inside a timeline, not until you force it into the constraints of physics. 19 minutes. That is the window. From first detection to final impact. 19 minutes to identify, track, assign, launch, and intercept every incoming object. On paper, it still feels possible, until you break it down. Each interception is not instantaneous. It requires a sequence. Detection, tracking, solution calculation, launch, mid-course correction, terminal guidance. Even under ideal conditions, this cycle takes time, not minutes, seconds. But those seconds are fixed. They cannot be compressed beyond a certain limit. And this is where the equation begins to collapse, because 5,000 targets do not arrive one after another. They arrive together, overlapping, competing for the same radar attention, the same interceptor inventory, the same computational bandwidth. Every second, new targets enter the system while previous engagements are still unresolved. Now the system faces a constraint it cannot escape. It cannot process all targets simultaneously. It cannot delay engagement without losing track. It cannot prioritize effectively when everything is equally urgent. Every possible action leads to another gap, another missed opportunity, another failure point. This is not saturation. Saturation implies excess. This is different. This is structural overload, a condition where the total demand exceeds not just capacity, but the fundamental architecture of response. And once that threshold is crossed, the outcome is no longer influenced by performance. It is determined by geometry, the angles of approach, the density of trajectories, the compression of time. These are not variables the system can negotiate with. They are constraints imposed from the outside. Constraints that define the battlefield before the first interceptor is even launched. Even a perfect system would face the same limit, even with flawless coordination, even with infinite accuracy. Because the limitation is not error, it is structure. And this is the moment the realization becomes unavoidable. The system was never meant to win this scenario. It was meant to handle something smaller, something slower, something that followed the rules it was designed around. But those rules no longer apply. And once the rules change, every layer built on top of them begins to fail in sequence. So the question is no longer how many targets can be intercepted. The question is, what kind of weapon forces the rules themselves to break? Because numbers alone are not enough to do this. Something else changed the equation. At first glance, it looks like a familiar system, a ballistic trajectory, a high-speed descent, a target locked by coordinates. Nothing about it should have broken the rules, and that assumption is exactly what made it dangerous. Because this was not a traditional ballistic missile. In its early phase, it behaved like one. It climbed. It followed a predictable arc. It gave the illusion of something the system already understood, something it had been trained to intercept. But that illusion only lasted for a moment. Then the behavior changed. As the missile entered its terminal phase, it stopped following a fixed path. It adjusted, it shifted its angle. It altered its descent in ways that could not be predicted in advance. Not random, not chaotic, but adaptive, responsive. And that single change breaks the entire interception model. Because interception depends on prediction. The system does not aim at where the target is. It aims at where the target will be. Remove that certainty, and every calculation becomes a guess made under time pressure. Now add speed. At hypersonic velocity, there is no margin for correction. No second attempt. The window between detection and impact becomes so small that even minor uncertainty compounds into complete failure. A few degrees of deviation. A fraction of a second delay. That is all it takes. But the equation shifts even further, because the missile is not just moving unpredictably, it is also seeing. In its final moments, it identifies structures, not coordinates, not general areas, specific targets. It corrects its own path in real time, aligning itself with the most critical points within the target zone. Communication hubs, command centers, infrastructure nodes. This is no longer a weapon designed to hit. It is a weapon designed to choose what it destroys. And that distinction matters. Because a system can absorb random damage. It can recover from imprecision. But when impacts are deliberate, when each strike is placed with intent, recovery becomes exponentially harder. Every hit compounds the next. Every impact removes a layer the system depends on. And then there is the part no one sees at first. The interference. Signals begin to degrade. Tracking becomes inconsistent, not because the radar has failed, but because something is actively shaping what it sees. Noise appears where clarity is needed. Gaps form where continuity is critical. The system is still operating, but its perception is no longer reliable. Now the system is fighting two battles at once, one against the incoming threat, and one against its own uncertainty. And this is where the equation finally breaks. Because even if the number of targets were lower, even if the timing were less compressed, the combination of speed, unpredictability, precision, and interference creates a condition where no stable solution exists. The system cannot predict. It cannot adapt fast enough. It cannot trust its own data. And once that happens, control is lost before impact ever occurs. But even this does not fully explain what happened. Because a weapon, no matter how advanced, is only as effective as the strategy behind it. And what happened that night was not just the use of a new weapon. It was the execution of a design. It did not happen all at once. That is the first illusion. From the outside, it looks like a single, overwhelming strike, a sudden collapse. A system crushed under sheer volume. But inside the timeline, the pattern is far more deliberate. The attack was divided, structured, sequenced with precision. The first wave was not designed to destroy. It was designed to reveal, to force the system to activate, to expose radar positions, to trigger interception protocols. 800 targets rising into detection range, just enough to demand a full response but not enough to immediately break capacity. The system responded exactly as expected. High-altitude interceptors launched, tracking networks locked in, resources committed, And in doing so, the system began to show its structure, its timing, its limitations. Then the second wave arrived. Closer launch points, shorter flight times. A different trajectory profile that forced a shift in interception layers. Now the system had to divide its attention. High-altitude threats were still being processed while mid-range engagements suddenly demanded priority. This is where strain begins. Not failure yet, but pressure. Because every system has a rhythm, a sequence it depends on. And once that sequence is disrupted, efficiency drops. Coordination slips. Small delays begin to accumulate. Then the third wave enters. By now, the system is no longer operating in clean cycles. Radar coverage is saturated. Communication between layers becomes inconsistent. Data is still flowing, but it is no longer synchronized. Each component is reacting to its own version of the battlefield. And that is when the environment itself begins to change. Electronic interference spreads across the engagement zone. Not enough to shut down systems completely, just enough to distort. To introduce uncertainty, targets flicker. Signals overlap. Confidence in tracking data begins to degrade. The fourth wave does not increase volume dramatically. It does something more effective. It arrives at a moment when the system is already unstable. When operators are already compensating for delays. When interception rates are already declining. Now every incoming object has a higher probability of passing through, not because it is stronger, but because the system is weaker. And then comes the final wave, not the largest, not the fastest, but the most decisive. It arrives when there is nothing left to coordinate. Interceptors are depleted. Radar clarity is compromised. Command structures are fragmented. At this point, impact is no longer a possibility. It is a certainty. And this is the critical insight. The attack was not designed to break the system through force. It was designed to dismantle it step by step, to remove its advantages one layer at a time, to transform a coordinated defense into a collection of isolated reactions. By the time the final wave arrived, the system was no longer defending. It was surviving. And survival is not enough when the objective is precision destruction. But this raises a deeper question. Because a strategy like this does not emerge in isolation. It requires understanding, not just of weapons, but of the system it is meant to defeat. So the question becomes unavoidable. Who understood the system well enough to design its collapse in advance? And how long had they been preparing for this moment? There was still time. That is the detail that changes everything. Not much time, not enough to stop everything, but enough to matter. Enough to alter the outcome at the margins, enough to demonstrate that the system was not entirely alone. Out in the Mediterranean, the assets were already in position. Detection systems had visibility. Tracking solutions were available. Interceptors were within operational range of at least part of the incoming trajectories. The window existed. Brief, narrow, but real. And within that window, a decision had to be made. The request moved fast. From detection to command. From command to authorization. Up through layers that were never designed to operate at this speed under this level of uncertainty. Each level understood the same thing. Acting would not be limited. It would not be contained. Because interception is not a neutral act. It is a declaration. To engage is to enter the conflict directly, to shift from observer to participant. And once that line is crossed, the response is no longer controlled by one side alone. It becomes a chain reaction, one that extends beyond the battlefield, beyond the region. So the calculation changes. It is no longer about how many targets can be intercepted. It becomes a question of consequence. What happens next? Who responds? How far escalation spreads? And in that moment, the variables expand beyond control. Multiple actors, multiple alliances, overlapping commitments that cannot all be honored at once. Any action taken in one direction creates exposure in another. Any attempt to intervene risks triggering a conflict far larger than the one already unfolding. So the system pauses, not because it cannot act, but because it cannot predict the cost of acting. and that uncertainty becomes decisive. Because time does not pause with it. The engagement window closes. The trajectories continue. The opportunity passes. No interceptor is launched. And that absence becomes more significant than any action could have been. Because in that moment, something becomes visible, not just to those directly involved, but to every observer with the ability to understand what they are seeing. The limits of commitment, the boundaries of intervention, the point at which capability exists, but will does not follow. And once that distinction is exposed, it cannot be reversed. It becomes part of the system itself, something every future decision must account for. But this is where the consequences extend far beyond a single battlefield. Because what was tested that night was not just a defense system. It was a structure, a network of guarantees, assumptions, agreements that had defined stability for decades. And in 19 minutes, that structure was forced into a situation it could not resolve. The question now is not whether it failed. The question is what remains after that failure becomes visible to the entire world. 19 minutes is not a long time. But it was enough. Enough to expose something that had been assumed for decades. Something that had never been fully tested under real conditions. Something that only reveals itself when every layer is pushed at the same time. Before that night, the structure appeared stable, not perfect, not invulnerable, but reliable. Capable of absorbing shocks, capable of adapting under pressure, capable of holding together when it mattered. That belief was not based on theory, it was based on history, repeated success, systems that had worked before, alliances that had held, responses that had arrived when needed. But those assumptions depended on one condition: that the stress applied to the system would remain within its design limits. That condition no longer exists. What happened was not just the failure of interception, not just the loss of a command structure. It was the exposure of a boundary, a point beyond which the system does not scale, does not adapt, does not respond. And once that boundary is visible, it changes everything that depends on it. Because systems like this do not operate in isolation. They are part of something larger, a network of expectations, commitments. Deterrence built not only on capability, but on belief. And belief is fragile. It holds as long as it is not tested too directly, as long as the outcomes remain predictable, as long as every actor assumes that the system will function when required. But after that night, that assumption is no longer automatic. Every observer saw the same sequence, the same limitation, the same moment where capability and outcome separated. And once that separation is understood, every future calculation changes. Allies begin to question timelines. Adversaries begin to test boundaries. Decisions that once relied on certainty now carry doubt. This is how systems degrade. Not through a single collapse, but through the gradual erosion of confidence in their ability to hold. And that erosion is far more difficult to repair than physical damage. Because infrastructure can be rebuilt, systems can be upgraded, technologies can evolve. But once the underlying belief is weakened, every component built on top of it becomes unstable. And this is the final shift. What was once considered a protective structure is now understood as a conditional one, dependent on variables that cannot always be controlled, limited by constraints that cannot always be overcome. The system still exists, but it no longer works the way people thought it did. And that difference, subtle at first, becomes decisive over time. Because future decisions will not be made based on what the system promises. They will be made based on what it has already failed to do. And once that mindset takes hold, the rules change. Quietly, irreversibly. Not in a single moment, but in every decision that follows. It does not end with impact. That is the mistake most observers make. They focus on the destruction, the visible outcome, the immediate damage. But the real shift happens after, quietly, in the way future decisions are made. Because once a system reveals its limits, those limits become part of every calculation that follows. Before that night, planning was built on expectation. Defense systems would intercept, allies would respond, escalation would be managed within known boundaries. These were not guarantees, but they were treated as reliable enough to act on. Now those assumptions have been replaced, not removed entirely, but weakened, conditional, dependent on factors that are no longer predictable under pressure. And that changes behavior. Adversaries do not need to prove the system can be broken again. They only need to know that it has been broken once. That knowledge alone shifts risk calculations. It lowers the threshold for future action. It creates space where caution once existed. At the same time, those who depended on the system begin to adjust, quietly at first. Redundancies are expanded. Independent capabilities are prioritized. Decisions that once relied on external support begin to move inward. Not out of panic, out of recognition, because the system still exists, but it is no longer absolute. And that is the defining change. Absolute systems create stability. Conditional systems create uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads, from military planning to political decisions, from regional strategy to global alignment. This is how a shift begins. Not with a formal declaration, not with a single event that everyone agrees defines a new era, but with a series of adjustments made in response to something that cannot be ignored. The event itself lasts minutes. The consequences unfold over years. And the most important part is this. Nothing that happened required new physics. Nothing violated known limits. Everything operated within constraints that had always existed. The only difference is that those constraints were finally reached, tested in a way that could not be dismissed or explained away. And once limits are reached, they become real. They stop being theoretical. They stop being edge cases. They become part of the environment, something every system must now operate within. That is the shift, not the destruction of one target, not the failure of one defense, but the transition from a world where limits were assumed to be distant to a world where those limits have already been crossed. And from this point forward, every strategy, every alliance, every system will be built with that understanding in mind. The rules have not been rewritten. They have been revealed.